Going over a Cram review for the AP Environmental Science course as is outlined by the College Board. So we're going to begin with broader topics such as abiotic versus biotic factors. You should definitely know all of these, but we're going to quickly cover them anyways. So abiotic factors are, of course, the non-living components of an ecosystem that influence living organisms, with examples such as sunlight, water, nutrients, pH, and salinity. Next up, we've got the biotic factors, of course, in meaning the opposite of abiotic. These are the living components of an ecosystem, with examples such as plants, animals, and microbes. Next up, a habitat, of course, another basic broad term, the physical area where an organism lives, providing necessary resources and conditions for survival. And then a connected term, niche. What is a niche? The niche, of course, is the role that an organism plays in its environment, including its resource use, interactions with other organisms, and its range of tolerance. Next up, we've got the three main relationships. First, mutualism, the plus, where both organisms benefit. Example could include bee pollinating a flower. Then we've got commensalism, the middle ground, the plus/0 you could think of, where one organism benefits and the other is neither harmed nor helped, such as barnacles on a whale. And finally, parasitism, the plus-negative relationship, where one organism benefits at the expense of the other, such as a tapeworm living inside of a human. Then we've got species interactions. We already covered these three at the bottom, but I'm going to quickly overview predation and competition as they're both pretty important, especially predation with the impact that it has had on evolution. So predation is an interaction where one organism, the predator, consumes another, the prey. This interaction drives coevolution, where predator and prey species evolve in response to each other. Think about the relationship between wolves and deer, where wolves evolved to hunt deer more effectively, whereas deer evolved to better evade wolves. So as you can see, predation has had a large impact on evolution throughout world history. And then competition. Competition occurs when different organisms or species vie for the same resources. Interspecific competition happens between different species, while intraspecific competition occurs within the same species. Now we're going into the actual units defined by the College Board. So first up, we've got energy flow, a key idea of the course. Now, of course, in a broad sense, energy flows from the sun to autotrophs to heterotrophs, and can be fueled by things such as photosynthesis, where light is transitioned into glucose and oxygen, and cell respiration, where glucose and oxygen are transitioned into ATP plus carbon dioxide and water. Next up, we've got the trophic levels, definitely important to know for the exam. You got the producers, then the primary, which are the herbivores, the secondary, the carnivores, and then the tertiary, who include the top predators. Then wrapping up with the decomposers, who are the fungi/bacteria. And an important rule to keep in mind is the 10% rule, where 90% of energy is lost as heat or waste at each level, meaning that only 10% moves on through the trophic levels. Now, we're going to move swiftly on to biogeochemical cycles. So, this essential cycle is driven by photosynthesis, respiration, combustion, and the storage of carbon and fossil fuels. So, now we're going to run through the 6 components of it. Bacteria and lightning convert atmospheric nitrogen into usable forms through nitrogen fixation. Then soil bacteria convert ammonia into nitrites and then into nitrates usable by plants. Plants incorporate nitrogen into organic molecules. Decomposers convert organic nitrogen back into ammonia. Bacteria convert nitrates back into atmospheric nitrogen, and then the weathering of rocks releases phosphorus, which cycles through soil, water, and living organisms. So again, this cycle is driven by photosynthesis, respiration, combustion, and the storage of carbon and fossil fuels, and is definitely something that you should remember. So if you want to just go back and look at this checklist, I definitely recommend doing that. Now, we've got biodiversity through genetic species and ecosystems. So high biodiversity leads to ecosystem resilience, which is why it's necessary in many ecosystems. Now, 2 important terms to know: island biogeography, which is the concept that larger islands closer to mainland have more species, and then the edge effect, which is where on the edge of ecosystems there's more biodiversity but also more vulnerability. Now, moving on to evolution and extinction, we've got a lot of important vocab packed here and in the next few slides, so take notes if you want to, or like I said, check out the course linked in the description. First up, natural selection, of course, the Darwinian theory of survival of the fittest. Then, speciation, the formation of new species. And now, we're going to go over the 3 tiers of extinction. So, of course, there's biological, when there's no members left. Then ecological, when the animal or species no longer fills its role. Then economic, when the species is not worth harvesting. Now, wrapping it up with 2 species-related terms, we've got keystone species, which have a disproportionate effect on ecosystems, such as wolves and sea otters, and indicator species, which signal environmental changes, such as frogs and trout. Next up, we're going to go into 3 sections related to population, starting with population dynamics. So the 2 growth models are exponential, which is the J curve and is the ideal growth model, and then logistic, which is the S curve, which includes carrying capacity. Next, carrying capacity, which we just talked about as a part of the S curve, is the max population an environment can support. And finally, biotic potential is the max reproductive rate. Now we talked about the basics of population, we're going to look into survivorship curves. So, type 1, or late death, are curves characterized by high survival rates early in life and throughout middle age, followed by a rapid decline in survival in later life. Humans in developed countries often exhibit this pattern due to access to healthcare and resources that promote longevity. Next up, we've got constant mortality, or type 2. Type 2 survivalship curves display a relatively constant mortality rate throughout the organism's lifespan. Squirrels, for example, face a consistent risk of predation, disease, and environmental factors, leading to a steady rate of mortality regardless of age. And then finally, early death, or type 3. These survivorship curves are characterized by high mortality rates early in life, with a relatively few individuals surviving to adulthood. Examples can include fish and insects, which produce large numbers of offspring but provide little parental care. Now, human population, to wrap up our population segment. There's the TFR, or total fertility rate, which is the average children per woman, followed by the replacement rate, which is around 2.1. This is, of course, the amount of children needed to maintain population. Now, some factors affecting TFR: education, healthcare, and cultural norms all play a large role in total fertility rate. And now, to wrap up our population, we're going to quickly go through 4 demographic transitions. Number 1, pre-industrial, which is where there's a high CBR and CDR. Number 2, transitional, where CDR drops and there's rapid growth. Number 3, industrial, where CBR drops and there's slower growth. And then finally, the opposite of pre-industrial, post-industrial, with a lower CBR and CDR. Now, we're going to look at Earth systems. Of course, to begin with, volcanoes and mountains form where plates collide. Next, another important thing to note is that mid-ocean ridges and rift valleys form where plates separate, so kind of the opposite of the formation patterns of volcanoes and mountains. Next up, earthquakes occur where plates slide into each other, such as at the San Andreas Fault. And now, some quick abbreviations. O for organic, A for topsoil, B for subsoil, C for weathered rock, and R for bedrock make up the soil profiles. Then we've got nutrient cycling, water filtration, and plant growth, which can be facilitated by these soil profiles. And then finally, the spheres. Troposphere, which is where the weather is, stratosphere, which is where the ozone layer lies, mesosphere, and finally thermosphere. Now, we're going to quickly go into energy before we begin to wrap up this cram. So, some renewable sources include solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and biomass. And then for our non-renewable sources, these can include coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear. So some of those much more popular energy sources. Then a quick fact about wind. Turbines can convert kinetic energy into electrical energy with efficiency around 35%, which isn't bad. And then finally, U-235 splits to heat water, but waste storage is a significant challenge. So that's one of the downsides of nuclear energy. Now we're going to look at pollution, which of course can stem from energy, which we just discussed. So first, for air pollution, the primary pollutants are CO, NOx, SO2, and PM, with secondary ones including O3 and acid rain. Now, of course, the Clear Air Act was passed to limit emissions. However, photochemical smog, which includes NOx plus VOCs and sunlight, could still be seen in many large cities. Next up, for our second type of pollution, we've got water pollution. So key terms to know are eutrophication, BOD, and dead zones. Now, there are 3 different types of wastewater treatment that are facilitated by the Clean Water Act, including primary, secondary, and tertiary, as the Clean Water Act was enacted to protect surface waters. And finally, we've got solid waste. In landfills, this can include methane and lactate. In incineration, they reduce volume, but there's toxic ash. And then with hazardous waste, it's important to know RCRA and CERCLA. Next up, for our final topic, global change. The last chapter in the AP Environmental Science curriculum and one of the most relevant in the present. So, some gases that connect with climate change are carbon dioxide, CH4, and N2O. Some of the impacts of climate change are, of course, sea levels rising, glaciers melting, and habitat loss. Now, in 2015, there was the Paris Agreement which called for global emission reductions, but there have been some complexities with that lately. However, that's not within the scope of the current course, so don't worry about that. Next up, we've got ozone depletion. So, CFCs destroy the ozone layer. However, in 1987, the Montreal Protocol was passed, and there was then a global CFC ban. And finally, biodiversity threats. Probably the most important acronym you can have for this course is HIPCO. Habitat loss for H, invasive species for I, pollution for the first P, population growth for the second P, climate change for the C, and finally overexploitation for the O. This is the most important acronym to know. You need to know all 6 parts of HIPCO, the biodiversity threats. And that's it. That is all of the curriculum included in the AP Environmental Science course guide. So now we're going to just look at some quick study strategies for APES success. First, focus your study going forward towards the exam on ecosystem interactions such as food webs and nutrient cycles. Understanding these interconnected systems deeply will give you a strong foundation for more complex topics. Next, memorize your must-know lists such as biomes, soil horizons, major pollutants and their sources, and key environmental laws and treaties. We did list some during this, but I would recommend going further by making a Quizlet or something to memorize them. Third, we've got the diagrams and processes. I would practice drawing out biogeochemical cycles like the nitrogen and carbon cycles that we discussed earlier, and then energy pyramids, population curves, and water treatment systems. We discussed most of these, but still I would recommend going a little bit further as you do your final preparations for the exam. Next up, mastering the FRQs. Just review the rubric, know what you're doing with the claim evidence reasoning, and effectively answer your FRQs, know how to label diagrams clearly and write concisely. And then finally, you can find real exams everywhere, whether it be on AP Classroom with College Board or maybe your teacher supplied a different one. And then, of course, there's ones from Barron's and Barron's books and Khan Academy ones everywhere. So as you're finishing up, you're cramming for APES, whether this be the night before or even the morning before that you're watching this video, just use all your resources to their maximum potential and memorize those must-know lists. And of course, don't forget HIPCO. Thank you for watching.